I always do things in threes, right? So in terms of the financial topic, I just wanted to talk a bit about our infrastructure, our debt situation, and then finally our post-employment benefits liability, which are, I think, all good stories right now. We'll start out with infrastructure here, and it all kind of leads up together, but I don't know if for you folks have been around the county a lot, but a lot of our buildings look like kind of a third world country. This is where you go to apply for a job, which people still have, you know, I can't believe I actually applied after I went into this building, and we had literally the third floor was infested with bats, and it was not a good situation. So we changed out that infrastructure really from a period of probably 2002 to 2008, when we got on a very ambitious building program, and one of the earlier ones here was the Judicial Center, our healthcare center, which is still held up very nicely. I'm really proud of these buildings and the programs that we run in them. And finally, the Lakeland School, which is just a very unique resource statewide or even nationally of a school focused on disabled children. So those were all good things, but in the process, we really piled up a massive amount of debt in order to do that, and that's kind of the thing I would talk about next. We continued on with some of the infrastructure issues, but I think with a little bit different financial footing. This is our vehicle maintenance facility out at our DPW shop to maintain all the big trucks that we use for the highway maintenance. But the last two slides that I'll show you here, these were paid with cash. This one about $7 million, and it's our old HHS building. But the new one, $22 million that we were able to purchase or pay for without bonding. So in that transition, we racked up a bunch of debt, but I think took a little bit different philosophy, I think, from a lot of governments in terms of how we wanted to manage the county's finances, and really looked at trying to become debt-free and trying to take care of our infrastructure within our current operating budget. So we were able to accomplish that so far. And a couple of the keys to doing that, I think, were, first just having the commitment to not borrow. And I think that resonates with a lot of people. I mean, even personally, I think at times I've been probably the most unhappy is, with debt, and when you don't have that hanging over your head, I think it's a good thing. So there was really the commitment by the board and by staff to try to get to this kind of position. But then there were some nuts and bolts things that we did to help facilitate this, and this is just kind of the cover of one of our studies, and this is really exciting reading, but it's our comprehensive roof assessment report, right? Not the most interesting reading, but important. And we have these for our mechanical systems and other building systems in our campus. And what the point of this was, at least, it allows us to plan ahead for major capital improvements of our buildings. So all these buildings seem relatively new to me. That's one of the problems. I think I've maybe been here too long, and I think we just built these things a few years ago. But like the jail is a 1995 building, and so being able to plan, the roof on there is well over $1 million. So, and then you repeat that with all of the rest of the buildings that we have. And so to be able to plan for those major upgrades is very important. This one's actually going to be done in this summer or yet at the sheriff's office. The second thing that we did, besides trying to plan for these repairs and put them in the budget, put them in our capital plan, was really take a kind of a different approach to funding our building program. And if nothing new to the business community here, I'm sure, but maybe more revolutionary in government, we use the funded depreciation approach to salt away money to build new facilities and also to take care of our old ones. So you see the area in red, and this was pulled, I think, from a 2018 budget book. Maybe it's not necessarily the most current, but it demonstrates the principle at least. So you've got the red area there, and that really is the book value of our buildings that depreciate over time as the building ages, right? And then the blue part is what we would fund. So we would the idea was that the whole thing would either be blue or red. We didn't really accomplish that yet, but we've come reasonably close. So the idea is that the building depreciates, we put money away in an equal amount in a fund that we can use to construct or to maintain buildings. And this is really the key to that vehicle maintenance facility and also our HHS building that we're able to build with current funds. Everybody has different problems and different issues to deal with, so I think one of the takeaways that I've had from our debt-free experience is not to judge others. This happens to be a real passion of mine. I can use a lot of different analogies, but I know different governments are facing different things, and we certainly did at the time when we had to redo all of our infrastructure. But you know, one of the examples that I liken it to is, you know, it's your own house, right? I think there's so many. You just add zeros for, you know, the county budgeting, really. I think, and you know, it wouldn't be reasonable to say, you know, I've lived in this house now for 20 years, and the roof is shot, and the air conditioner doesn't work, and the windows are old, and so let's tear it down and build a new one, and I need to borrow, you know, $200,000 to build a new house. The idea is, I think, in our personal lives that we maintain these assets with, generally speaking, the money that you have for your family budget, and so I'm not sure why. I think government should do more of that personally, but we were able to pull that off, at least for now. We'll see if that lasts, right? So the buildings and the physical plant is part of our infrastructure, but the bridges, roads, and the county are also our responsibility to maintain and pay for. And so to that end, we had actually, for some not good reasons, had moved our road program onto borrowed funds. And the idea was, at the time, you know, you hear about this levy limit, tax levy limit, right? And that's real, and it's something that hopefully we can talk about a little bit today. But there was a time when borrowing was excluded from the cap, right? So you can see where this is going when the county, and this is probably about 1999, 2000, when the county started to hit that cap, then the idea was, well, let's just borrow for our roads, take it out from under the cap, and then we can use that for something else. So that took really from 2011 to about, well, probably about a 10-year period, I think, until we were able to return that onto the tax levy and pay for it with current dollars. So one of the keys, I think, that we look at with this is try to set standards, and we've done a lot more of that in recent years, because if you don't set a standard or a benchmark for what you want, it's really difficult to say whether you've achieved your target or whether you should raise the bar or whether you're overdoing things. So in the road world, the PACER system, P-A-S-E-R, it's an acronym which I don't know. Oh, there it means Pavement Surface Evaluation Rating System, right on my slide, right? So this is it's a way of evaluating roads to determine a scale of 1 to 10. So we set the goal of having an average of 7 ranking on our county trunk highway system, and that doesn't mean that everybody's driving on a 7, because some are on 9s, and you may have taken a 4 into work today or to this event. But the idea is that we maintain that average rating, and so if folks are not happy with the state of roads, at least we have a starting point, right? And then we could, if you raise that to an 8, then you spend more money, or if you lower it to a 6, well, then you have a savings. So we've done that. The other thing that we committed to is really replacing all of our bridges. That's a hot topic now nationally with the deteriorating bridges and infrastructure. So we've got a program between now and 2028 where we're replacing all of the bridges that we own. I just threw this slide in here. I guess another one of the things that we're trying to really deal with right now is some of these large items of equipment, and the patrol trucks being one. I threw this slide in just because I think you'll see more of this at the county and municipal level, where we're in this transition between using salt brine and the traditional dry salt, right? And so that adds some challenges, because these trucks are about $250,000 each, and to transition that fleet to the liquid delivery systems is kind of a trick, because if you're operating both, that's not very efficient. So that's one of the bigger issues that we're going to have facing us in the 2020 budget to plan for that. And the brine thing is really probably a good good idea, just based on environmental impact of using all that road salt. And there's a study going on right now at the Southeast Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission that I think will be very interesting. It almost has some national implications when they come out. So you're going to see more of this. We've got generated quite a few calls. People, think that we're putting water on the roads or something like that. But it is supposed to. It keeps more of the product on the road and less rolling off into the ditches. So this is a little bit of the history of our borrowing, and you don't necessarily have to get caught up in all the different colors. That's the projects that we had borrowed for, but this is actually our debt service. So around 2010, we were paying $10 million a year in principal and interest on about $55 million worth of general obligation debt. And this shows the downward decline. The more depressing part was when it was ramping up, because every year we'd add maybe $2 million plus to the debt service load, and that's like creating a small county department every year. It really had a significant impact on the budget, and we were able to quit borrowing in 2011 and then called debt as aggressively as we could. We had some 20-year bonds that were out there and trying to use every opportunity we could to pay it off early. And we were able to do that from 2008 until last year, when we had our bond burning party on the lawn of the courthouse, the old courthouse. So I don't know. We always had said, well, I don't know if we're the only debt-free county. Nobody really could give us that statistic. Maybe be a thing for Rob Hinken to check out with the Public Policy Forum. This showed, at least when we did the last time, 2015 was the last data that we had, everybody was carrying some general obligation debt. There's your eye test for today. Read that chart. That led to a AAA rating from Moody's, which was really on our bucket list of goals to accomplish. One of 6 Wisconsin counties to achieve that, and it's neat to get the accolade. I think in the past, at least some of the criteria that Moody's had used to evaluate counties didn't favor us, and that was not management, but really demographics and the economy. But we'd always make our case, and finally they probably got tired of listening to us on conference calls and gave us that rating, which will help for future borrowing if we need to do that. Of course, the adage here for all the bankers in the room is, you can borrow money when you don't need it, right? So that's probably why we got the high credit score. Another story here really is dealing with our post-employment benefit liability, and this is the promises that the county made to retirees to pay basically their health insurance when they retired. And when health insurance was a very cheap or low-cost kind of benefit years and years ago, these appeared in union contracts that you could get certain rights to health insurance when you retired. And when we finally had looked at that in about 2004, that obligation was about $23 million in value in different ways. I think this chart takes a little bit different methodology. But the idea was that if we didn't rein this in, we were just going to be paying for retirement benefits rather than programming in the future. So we actually are one of the few places, I think, that has an OPEB asset, so that the account that we use to pay these benefits actually is an asset. And it started, I'm a big fan of, Journey of 1,000 Miles starts with a single step. And so when we were looking at about $23 million liability in 2005, we made a $300,000 contribution to it. And it seems kind of pointless, like a drop in the bucket. But the idea was that it got that on people's minds, on the board's mind. And I think to understand the importance of the situation. The other idea of starting to get this into our system is the idea that we draw down a lot of federal and state revenues, and this is part of our labor costs of paying this benefit. So we're able to draw on revenue from some of these other sources to pay for that. So you see, we had ramped up our contributions, which at the time when we were also paying down debt about. We've contributed about 19, or you have contributed 19, make that clear, right? As taxpayers, $19.4 million. The value today is about $25 million, and that's because we're expert investors. It's had to do, I think, with timing, and we got in these funds are invested a little bit differently than our our other funds, so it has some exposure to the stock market, and timing's everything, right? I guess we got in that at the right time. So hopefully I won't come back some year after the Dow has crashed and tell you that we're broke. So it's about a 50-50 equity and bond portfolio that we're in. We wanted to talk just a little bit about the economic recovery, and it seems like, well, gee, that was ancient history, but there's still some kind of interesting ramifications to this. Talking about 2008, 2009, and the whole banking crisis. The one that still kind of fascinates me is equalized value in the county has still not recovered from 2009, which I think is interesting. We're one of the few counties in the state with that dubious distinction, I guess. So this shows, really the big hit in equalized value. This means the value of all the real property in the county, taxable real property, right? And we were a real high flyer for many years when, you can see that when it shot up. And so you'd have 12, 14, 15% increases year over year. A lot of it had to do with appreciation of property, increased price of property, maybe more than development, although there was a fair amount of that too. But we really hit the skids after. We had one more year, which was kind of an anomaly. 2009, we actually had an increase, and then after that, it declined precipitously. So you look at 2009, we're still not at the equalized value that we were then. So this might be the year, I don't know. But there's only a few counties that have not made a complete recovery. I thought this was kind of interesting and contrasted with the sales tax that we collect. County has a half-cent optional, most counties have it now, and that has gone up considerably since 2009. So people are definitely buying things, which is a good thing, but the real estate has not necessarily recovered, and this shows the sales tax revenue. Slide on unemployment here. I'm not going to take credit for that. Unemployment is low in Walworth County, low in Wisconsin as well. I'm always a little bit low in the United States, right? I'm always a little bit skeptical of this particular figure. I think there's a lot of folks who are just not looking for work at all. I don't pretend to be an expert in that, but I'm not sure we're necessarily at full employment. So I'll just kind of wind up my remarks here with some of the challenges that I think are laying ahead here in the future for Walworth County, which includes the tax levy cap. I alluded to that a little bit earlier. We've got a large communications project that we're looking at, fire and EMS services in the county, our nursing home and the state of skilled nursing facilities in Wisconsin, and then just a little bit about demographics. So the tax levy cap is something people just get sick of hearing about, but it's a very real factor that we have to deal with. So essentially under state law, the levy growth, the amount that we can tax, local property tax, cannot exceed the greater of 0% or the increase in net new construction. So really the only way that our local tax levy can grow is through new construction. So every time you see a Fleet Farm or something like that being built, assuming it's not in a TIF, which is a whole other issue that takes it out of the equation, that allows for municipal budgets to increase. And that figure in Walworth County has been very low. It's been countywide, probably in the last few years, it's certainly averaged under 1%. So we just, having to provide services with this cap is a challenge for us. We've had some fairly low tax increases. The last 2 years were actually negative. That had to do with, we used all of our room under this levy cap, but it had to do with the feature of paying off our debt. But if you see, we're at 0.5%, a little over 0.5%, and then a couple negative years. So that has been really availing ourselves of pretty much the entire cap that's available, at least in the most recent years. So I just talked about blowing our own horn about how we paid off all that debt, but we've got one big project coming up, which is emergency communications infrastructure in the county, and this is really all the radios, this is one of the towers that we have downtown, all of that infrastructure, the technology that supports fire and police and public works, their radio system. And ours is reaching the end of life, and so that has got a pretty significant price tag to it. Estimated cost of the project $25.1 million. And so this kind of threw a monkey wrench into our debt-free situation. I'm not sure that where it stands right now, it was kind of difficult to get a figure of what this is going to cost, and I think we're getting closer to that. The initial consultant had come up with this $25 million figure, and when we plugged that into the budget, we did not have current dollars to pay for that. They're actually getting a second opinion, which I think is prudent. The sheriff runs the communications center, so that study will be coming out to see whether the first one was on mark, and we may have, I think this at least got the board's attention, and you don't want to compromise public safety for the sake of, having a debt-free title, but the jury's still out on this one, so maybe we can do something yet that will manage this. Not necessarily a county government issue, but one that's certainly important to the county residents is the state of fire EMS in the county. And we have a study committee. Denise Peroni's here. She's been on that faithfully for several years now. I'm not sure we've come to any big breakthroughs yet, but the problem is that the system relied heavily on volunteers in rural communities, and God bless them for going to these scenes, some of them just without pay at all. And that system is really becoming much more fragile, and there's people will disagree and sometimes get angry about the reasons for that. I think some of them are individuals not working in their communities anymore, that they're commuting to different places, so they're not available, for instance, during the day. Other younger people having a different mindset about volunteering, that they will volunteer but more on their terms, which is kind of contrary to what you have to do when there's a fire. You got to answer the call. So a host of, and people get sensitive about this. People, it's kind of like some of the service clubs I go to, and I know I see somebody at those. It's a different, that's it. We're making a transition here, and so we'll see where it ends up. But the fire EMS is one that we're studying right now. It's in some communities it's a very significant issue. So this was a committee that we started in 2016, and with the goal to ensure that the services are sustainable. Counties can't run fire departments. So the idea is that we will help to study this issue. We've got some fire chiefs, medical control for our dispatch, and on this particular committee. Switch gears here to our Lakeland Healthcare Center. This is our skilled nursing facility, 120 beds. It's a neat place and a good program. But the challenge, I think, is really pretty shocking, and one that I think is kind of flying under the radar. So this is statewide statistics. Nursing homes lose between $70 and $78 a day for each Medicaid resident. So if people can't do private pay, which is very expensive, and it's a Medicaid payment, it's very difficult for nursing homes to meet their bottom line. Let's say $324 million that Wisconsin nursing homes were underfunded during that 6-year period. So this is the part that really caught my attention. Since 2016, 30 nursing homes have closed statewide. 11 just since January of 2019. They just had a story, 3 of them in the Milwaukee area had closed just this year. 27 facilities under receivership. So there's a pretty high percentage of the actual nursing homes that are in the state. And I'm not quite sure, at some point this is really going to break down, I think, even more significantly. In addition to underfunding from Medicaid, a lot of these caregiver positions just go unfilled. They estimated about 20% of caregiver positions are unfilled. That's been our experience. We've got 120 beds. Our census is probably running maybe around 108 or so, simply because we don't have workers to staff the residents who need an increasing amount of care. This is from our own example here, our private pay rate. So if you might be, if anybody's selling long-term insurance, you might want to take heed of this and think about getting some. $320 a day is what we charge for a private pay rate. And you can see the Medicaid reimbursement of $167 a day. So the private pay is what pays our bills, right? That's what it costs to run it. We supplement ours with about $2 million. You supplement ours with $2 million of tax levy money. A private operator doesn't have that, right? So you see why they're going under. And we're trying our level best to keep delivering the service. Finally, my slides on demographics here, and this is where I probably get out of my expertise a little bit, but I wanted to at least show some of the things that I think we're looking at in the future, trying to deal with. And one is a more static population. And you go back, the early 2000s, we were one of the fastest growing counties in the state. I think we're on the list of 3 or 5 usually annually, and that has slowed down very significantly. And you can see that from this particular bar chart, where it's really plateaued in more recent years and starting. We have slowed that growth down. We're not losing population, I guess, like northern Wisconsin is, but definitely one of the slower growth counties. And I think this is a list which is always kind of weird to me, of counties with a slower growth than Walworth County. So that's definitely probably a quarter of the county. So more of the counties have a more rapid population growth than we do. Which it's interesting. There's sort of this Jekyll and Hyde kind of philosophy in the county, where once people have moved here, close the doors, and people like the space, peace and quiet, and all those things. But if you consider that that the growth of the tax base is really impacted by new construction, having a zero population or very low population growth definitely impacts how we have to think about services in the future. I guess you can say on the positive side, we have not as many people to deliver those services to, but it is something that we have to deal with. I put charts. The second thing, okay, so we're talking about a lower population growth, but the other thing is, I hate to break this story, we're getting older. I know I'm getting older, and that's going to have some real significant ramifications. And we're not even, you look at those dark blue counties, those are the ones that are really aging quickly in terms of the population. And we're not in that club, but I mean, to put it in perspective, a lot of it is senior rides, and so we've got my assistant Nicole Hill runs the program and does an excellent job with it, but that has been almost exponential growth, I think, since we rolled this wall-to-wall dial ride program out. So with that, I think I'll end up my remarks, and yes, sir.
Our next speaker is Rob Henkin.
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning. I think the way that you set up the program actually works very well, because Dave obviously honed in on the state of Walworth County. I'm going to give you a little bit of a broader perspective. I'm going to hone in a little bit on the state of Wisconsin's overall fiscal condition, and how some very important recent state policy changes and policy imperatives have impacted local governments, both county governments and municipal governments across the state and in Walworth County. So I think this will dovetail very nicely. So before I get into that, just a little bit of background on my organization. We are the Wisconsin Policy Forum. We were created a year ago, January, when the Milwaukee-based Public Policy Forum, which has been around in Milwaukee since, believe it or not, 1913, merged with the Madison-based Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, which was a relative newcomer to the scene, had only been around since 1932. So here you have two long-time established, we like to say modestly, credible policy organizations known for their impartiality and nonpartisanship that decided to get together to form a statewide policy research organization. What is most critical about this merger is that we maintain our mission of providing informed, nonpartisan analysis of critical policy issues. And we look at local governments, school districts across the state, as well as state government. And I think that we can really factually, honestly say that we are the only independent policy think tank that comes at things from a purely middle-of-the-road, nonpartisan, impartial perspective. Now, I'll give a test this morning. If anyone detects any partisanship or partiality in my comments, please come up and tell me that, because what has kept both organizations going for these many, many decades, somehow, even as we become more politically polarized in this country, in this state, in this county, we have been able to toe that line and maintain that reputation. Why did we merge? Lots of reasons. Bottom line is we now have increased capacity. We're putting out at least one research publication per week. Those publications are available to anyone to see on our website, wispolicyforum.org. We think we can be even more effective in terms of providing that objective policy analysis. Everybody knows where to go when they want partisan policy analysis, and unfortunately, increasingly, that's where most people do go, is to news outlets and other places that do have a point of view. We think the need for policy analysis from an organization that doesn't have an ideological point of view is increasingly important in today's age. Finally, we're a membership organization. There are some members in this crowd. Marcus Corporation has been a very long-time member and supporter of the forum. We enjoy support from nearly 1,000 businesses, local governments, institutions, nonprofits, individuals, statewide. We work very hard to do that. If too much of our support came from the corporate side, I think people might naturally assume that we skew toward the right. If too much of our support came from the government or nonprofit side, maybe they think we skewed a little bit toward the left. So we work very hard to maintain that diverse membership. I'm not here to pitch membership to any of you, but if you're interested, there's lots of information on our website. So let's get into the matter at hand. Dave gave you a sort of fiscal checkup of Walworth County. I'm going to try in 3 slides to give you a fiscal checkup for the state. Both WSTAX and the Public Policy Forum obviously have been following state finances very closely for many, many years. We tend to annually come out with sort of our view of where things stand, and so we do that every year and we update it. And I don't think there's any question that when we think about the state of Wisconsin and its finances, that things are improving. We use a series of metrics actually established by others, groups like the Government Finance Officers Association, that tend to be used pretty routinely to try to gauge the fiscal health of governmental bodies. So one is just the annual change in net assets on a per capita level. Net assets are what they seem like they would be, cash on hand, reserves, also physical assets. And obviously at the end of every year, while government is not out there to make money, you'd rather see a positive change in per capita net assets than a negative change. That wasn't happening even prior to the recession. So you would have sort of expected that plummet in 2009 in the depths of one of the worst economic recessions our country has faced. But there have been other years where things were not going so well either. Bottom line is, though, and if we had updated this for 18, the only reason we haven't is we like to also make national comparisons of that data. Those data are not available yet. But if we had, you'd see certainly we have seen a trend of seeing positive changes in per capita net assets, and that's a good thing. Another indicator is long-term liabilities as a percentage of assets. You want to see that percentage hopefully going down, and in this case, that indeed is what we have been seeing. So these are good, positive fiscal indicators that are reflective of the fact that a concerted effort is being made in Madison, despite the political polarization, despite the disagreement. I think both parties intend on making sure that we are doing a better job building our reserves, not spending our cash on hand, particularly as the economy is improving. Because if you're doing those things when your economy is improving, you don't have those resources on hand to prepare yourself for those rainy days. Speaking of which, another very important indicator that gets a lot of attention is whether your general fund savings and your rainy day funds are actually being built. Here we did update this for 2018. We think we know that 2019 is going to look even better. But what this is showing you is the ending cash balance for the state combined with its rainy day fund, as a percentage of general fund expenditures. So in 2018, essentially our savings equated to about 5.4% of our annual general fund expenditures. So here too you see improvement, that's the good news. The bad news is if you compare Wisconsin across the other 49 states, you'll see that we're still in about the bottom third in terms of money on hand. And for those of you who have been following the state budget, you'll know that this is actually an issue that's being debated right now. What is the appropriate level of reserves compared to what some would say has been sort of a pattern of disinvestment? So to what extent should we be using those reserves to address that issue? And I'll talk to that, about that a little bit more in just a moment. So that gives you a snapshot of sort of the state's fiscal condition. Now, certainly good news, I'm sure, for the vast majority of the people in this room, is on the tax front. So when we look at taxes in Wisconsin, whether rightly or wrongly, has typically enjoyed a reputation as being on the high side in terms of taxation. Some people may not be aware of it. This newspaper headline is from September of 2017, that we have now fallen below the national average when it comes to the tax burden. So what do I mean by tax burden? Wceda has kept tabs of the tax burden. I could have shown you this chart going back to the 1950s. The way we define it is essentially the total taxes paid by the residents of the state as a percentage of the total income that is made by the residents of the state. So here, in terms of tax burden, you want to see again a lower percentage. And you can see a real impressive downward shift. And this 10.5% is now slightly below the national average if you look across the 50 states, clearly well below the 13.2% that we saw in 1988. Now, there are lots of factors that have been going into this, and you have to certainly understand that there's both a numerator and a denominator. So if we do nothing at all to cut taxes anywhere, but incomes are going up, then that tax burden is going to decline. So it's a factor of both of those things. So I don't want you to jump to any conclusions. But I don't think there's any question, and Dave touched upon it, that there's been a real focus at the state level, in particular on the property tax. Certainly a sense that we have very high property taxes in this state, and comparatively speaking, we do. What many people are not aware of, particularly when you get those tax bills in the mail in December, is that here is where we have made very specific progress. Again, the tax burden being defined in this case as total property taxes paid by the residents of the state as a percentage of income that the residents of the state are accumulating or making in a given year. And so that percentage has declined markedly. And here we do go back all the way to the 1940s. So again, in terms of solely looking at this through the lens of I want my property taxes to be reduced, clearly progress being made. So you may or may not have anticipated, given my remarks at the beginning, that we are a fiercely nonpartisan organization, that there may be some buts involved here. And so now I'm going to get into just a few buts, because there's another side of this picture. There's, on the one hand, I think, a very encouraging, promising picture in terms of what's going on at a very high level in terms of state finances and state taxes. But we have noticed that there are also some issues that are beginning to materialize that certainly deserve the attention of policymakers. So Dave spared you and didn't go into the details of the property tax levy limits. I could probably talk to you for the next half hour on the levy limits, but I won't. I'll summarize them very quickly, and he already did a lot of this for me, so thank you. As again, to restate, the state legislature decided actually back in 2006 that it was going to put limits on the ability of municipal and county governments to increase their property tax levies in a given year. And originally, and still today, those levy limits were tied to the growth that the community is experiencing in net new construction. And intuitively, that would make a lot of sense. What you're trying to do, or would hope to do, in terms of if you indeed need to raise property taxes each year to keep up with your fixed costs if you're a local government, that to the greatest extent possible, you would hope that that increase in property taxes would be generated from new construction as opposed to having to increase taxes for existing property owners. So intuitively makes sense. Important to note that in the first several years in which these levy limits were in place, there were floors. So in that case, if you were Walworth County and your growth in net new construction was 0.7%, there may have been a floor that year in the budget that said it's, however, you can either, it's the greater of 2% or whatever your growth in net new construction is. So in that given year, if Walworth County wanted to, it could have increased its property tax levy by 2%, not the 0.7%. And this does, as Dave said, also just apply to operating levies, not to debt service. The floors, as you can see from the slide, were at various levels in various years. But in 2011, the floors were eliminated. So as we stand here today, the levy limits are solely linked to growth in net new construction. Now, Governor Evers, in his budget proposal, tried to change that, tried to reestablish a floor of 2%. However, the Joint Finance Committee removed that. So that's where we are today. Now, important to note that this decision to construct levy limits this way, and there are lots of different ways that lawmakers could have constructed levy limits, that was made during a construction boom. What we are seeing, and Dave told you the story for Walworth County, is that at the time that those levy limits went into effect, if I had gone back another 4 years, you would have seen that for the 5 years preceding that decision in 2006, statewide average growth in net new construction, every one of those years was 2.5 to 3%. And so without knowing what the rate of inflation was in those years, my sense is if I were to say to you that, you know, allowing local governments to go up 2.5 to 3% on the levy every year, maybe there's some reasonability there. What happened, however, certainly in the recession, but also coming out of the recession, is that growth in net new construction slowed down considerably. And so even in 2018, in the midst of a pretty robust economic recovery, statewide average growth in net new construction was only 1.6%. So by constructing the caps this way, we are putting some pretty severe limits on the ability of local governments to raise their property taxes. And that's an eye in the beholder question. Some of you may be saying, good, you know, you go. Others may be saying, well, gee, when we think of fire and police salaries and equipment needs and new radios and things like that, maybe there is a need at least for local governments to have the ability to increase their levies from year to year to at least approximate the growth in the consumer price index or whatever other economic factors you might want to take into account. The other thing we are seeing is, and I'm sorry, I don't know why the fonts, some of these slides are a little messed up, but one of the other things that we are seeing is that while I can give you an average and tell you that average growth in net new construction is 1.6%, that's an average. That's being skewed by those who are seeing lots of growth. And indeed, even in 2018, only 32% of the state's cities and villages saw net new construction that exceeded 1.5%, and only 21% saw net new construction that exceeded 2%. So these limits are pretty stringent. Why is that important? It's important because the revenue structure that we have created for municipal and county governments in the state of Wisconsin is rather unique. We have created a structure that says to our local governments, your two primary sources of revenue to support all of the important things that you do are going to be property taxes and state aids. And the largest form of state aids come from the state shared revenue program. That's far more important for municipal governments than for county governments. But I've told you about sort of these strict limitations on property tax levy growth. Shared revenue, the shared revenue program, and these numbers are not adjusted for inflation, has actually declined over the past 18 years. So the two foremost sources of revenue on which your local governments depend have really been pretty darn flat for many, many, many successive years. And again, that's an eye of the beholder type of situation where some of you may be saying that's a good thing, that's forcing them to be lean and mean and responsible. Others may be saying, but gee, after how many years of doing this are you going to get to the point where service levels may start to suffer, and is that a consequence that we all want? Why is the state shared revenue program not only not kept pace with inflation, but not grown at all? Well, one of the problems is that we have other big pressures and priorities at the state level. So Medicaid, school aids, and corrections have, for the most part, seen considerable growth as a percentage of general fund spending, while shared revenue has seen a major decline. And this is a function of both, again, prioritization, whether rightly or wrongly, providing increases in state support for K-12 schools, for the most part, over this long period of time, and in certain years this has been different, has been a higher priority than providing growth in aids to county and municipal governments. Point of fact, not saying whether it's right or wrong. Corrections, the need to spend more in corrections has been driven by other laws and policies at the state level, as well as just general ups and downs in terms of crime rates. And Medicaid has been a factor of a lot of things, not the least of which is just growing healthcare inflation. So this is a big part of the story. I would be remiss if I didn't say that there's still another part of this story, and that is, while I can stand here before you and tell you that the extremely flat nature of the two primary revenue sources is creating some potentially unintended consequences. During this period of time, of course, we had the adoption of Wisconsin Act 10 that did provide local governments with enhanced ability to control some of their fixed costs, particularly when it comes to non-public safety workers and their fringe benefits and salaries. So, a few of the manifestations of this, we went back and we scoured municipal spending data. So I'm going to talk about municipal stuff now. I know this is state of the county, but I also know we have some municipal leaders in the room, and what's happening at your municipal level is obviously very important to what's happening at your county level. So if the goal was to slow spending growth among cities and villages in the state of Wisconsin, mission accomplished. You can see the comparison between the 1994-2005 decade and the 2005-2016 period. Where, however, within that have we seen growth, and it's, again, Mr. Brettel set me up perfectly here. We have seen an increase in debt service despite this slowdown. So again, that slowed a little bit too, but still increases in debt service payments among municipal governments is exceeding overall spending growth. And part of the reason for that, we surmise, and I can't prove this to you yet, is indeed that because debt service falls outside of those levy limits, there, we believe, and we've heard this certainly from several municipal administrators, that there's actually this sort of perverse incentive to issue debt instead of to do what Walworth County is doing, because then those debt service payments fall outside of the caps. And so I don't think that was the intent of constructing the caps this way, but we suspect that that is what we are seeing here to some extent. This again shows, we broke this down by size of municipality, and again, you see the trend is roughly the same for all types of groupings in terms of populations of different municipal governments. What else are we seeing? Well, while we're seeing that growth in debt service in terms of spending growth, we're seeing average spending growth for transportation is lagging total expenditure growth. So if you're concerned about the conditions of your roads, this may be somewhat problematic. We are seeing a shift away from investment in parks, rec, and culture. And one of the things that we think is going on here is that police and fire tend to be the highest priorities for municipal governments, and many would argue that that should be the case. And so sort of in this valiant effort to maintain spending levels on police and fire, we are seeing other functions suffer. Again, value judgments there as to whether that's acceptable or not, but a circumstance that we are observing that I think is pause for thought is that are we creating sort of this vicious cycle here? When you think about the factors that allow communities to grow, oftentimes you think about the need to invest in things like transportation infrastructure, in parks and recreation, things that are going to attract new residents and businesses. And so to the extent that we have communities that aren't growing, who are then unable to invest in those types of things, are we sort of locking them into a cycle of slow growth, while conversely, those communities that are growing do have the wherewithal to continue investments in areas like this, and they're encouraging more growth. Again, we haven't completed the research where I can definitively tell you that this is what is happening, but we are seeing certainly indications, and I'm not showing you all of our maps, that show that sort of vicious cyclical thing is beginning to occur. So, I'm going to conclude by just talking about, very briefly, two other sort of related issues. So I've talked a lot about expenditures. We were very intrigued to look at whether the revenue structure we have created here for our local governments, how that compares to the other 49 states. And so we produced a report last February called, or this past February, called Dollars and Cents. And we looked at the extent to which cities and villages statewide in each of the 50 states are reliant on property taxes as a share of their total municipal revenue. How does Wisconsin compare? And you can see we're off the charts. Our municipal governments average 42.2% of their revenues are coming from the property tax. Nationwide, the average is 23.3%. You can see in other major categories, we're roughly similar with one exception. We see that most other places allow local sales tax authority, not only for their counties, as we do here in Wisconsin, where counties have the option to go up to just a half cent, but at the municipal level, and in particular for their largest cities. And why is that? That is because there are many municipal services that are being used out there, not just by residents, but by visitors. So when we think of Lake Geneva, we think of all the people who are coming and using municipal services when they're here using the beautiful Marcus Center, Grand Geneva Resort, and so forth. But the sales taxes that they are paying are only going to the state and the county. They're not going to the municipal government. For Milwaukee, where there are tens of thousands of suburban commuters every day, myself included, who use city services, because the tax structure is such that we're only essentially hitting residents, we're not tapping into that. So, an observation. We see how things have changed over time, and so this is going to look counterintuitive to you. I just told you about these very stringent limits on property taxes, yet we have seen the extent to which property taxes have overtaken state aid as a percentage of revenue for Wisconsin municipalities. And that's because while property taxes have inched up slowly, state aids have gone down. And so once upon a time, the situation was reversed. We also see perhaps another unintended consequence, that as we have seen these strict limitations on the property tax and stagnant state aid, municipal governments are turning more and more to fees. And on the one hand, I might argue to you, fees are a good way to pay for government services because they link usage of services to the generation of revenue to support those services. There are other reasons why fees aren't as good. They tend to be very regressive, and so there's, and so I can't tell you whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a thing that's occurring, and it's something that again we ought to be keeping our eye on, because we are sort of, you know, whether intentionally or not, we are creating this, and it's happening. We looked at other states. I'm running out of time, so I don't want to go into it. Other states, again, suffice it to say, we really honed in on Midwestern states and have very different frameworks for collecting their revenues. I'm not going to go into our options. I'm just going to close by saying, so we obviously have now in Madison a state budget fight going on. How does all of that impact everything I've been telling you about? Well, first of all, when we look at the governor's budget proposal, we see sort of the continuation of one of the slides I showed you earlier. Yeah, we see big increases in spending, mostly going to Medicaid, school aids. That local aid tax credits bar is misleading because most of that is tax credits. So again, the governor was proposing a 2% increase in shared revenue, which would have been the largest increase in years. That has now been taken out of the budget by the Joint Finance Committee. But so we're sort of seeing a continuation of the trend I described earlier. A real concern we have is that when you look to the second year of the biennium under the governor's proposal, we're able to finance a lot of this new investment, which arguably, in many cases, is badly needed. by starting to dip into that general fund balance. And so that's not a sustainable picture. The good news is we built a big balance. The bad news is that we really start to dip into it, and you could really question whether now, when times are good, is the time to do that. In my very bipartisan way, I will tell you that the Republican budget is essentially suggesting the same thing, though doing it differently. So this is, I think, a real concern from my beginning slides about our sort of long-term fiscal health. Clearly, we have a favorable revenue picture now than we did when the governor actually introduced his budget. But a key question is, what are we going to do with these increased revenues, and are we going to invest in a way that's going to be sustainable over time? In terms of local government impacts to the government to the state from the state budget, again, the relaxed levy limits have been removed by JFC, as well as the shared revenue boost. However, there is a 10% boost in general transportation aids that would be very helpful for local governments that was proposed by the governor and has been supported so far by the legislature. No action in terms of diversifying the financing frameworks for our local governments. So I'm going to end right there, and I don't know if the questions at the end.
Thank you, Rob. Seems like any business that I go into or drive by these days has a sign out front that says now hiring. And so I'm sure that the information we're going to hear from Tom Walsh about workforce development is topical and something of interest. Tom Walsh.
Thank you. I can't say how happy I am to have a podium. As a labor market economist, I have no clue what to do with my hands. So it's great to be able to kind of hide behind here and be kind of behind a computer and kind of in front of people at the same time. It's like a good little balance between my normal day-to-day and being here. So as a labor market economist, and part of my position description is to analyze information and disseminate information. The analyzing part's really easy. I can do that all day. But it's really kind of worthless unless I actually get out here and tell people about it. So this is a really good opportunity to do that, and hopefully you kind of find it pretty valuable. Just again to recap a little of my experience, I am new in my current position, but I spent 5 years in the tech system before that, and I was a labor market economist in north central Wisconsin prior to going into higher education. So I'm both new and old at the same time, so hopefully it's a useful perspective for this group. Just one thing I like to start out with is when I come to something like this, I feel like if you walk away with one thing, I've done my job. If you walk away with two things, I've exceeded expectations. And if you walk away with three, I really knocked it out of the park. So that's my way of telling you guys, whatever you have in mind, just lower it a little bit. and just try and maybe let's focus on doing a few things that we can take away to our desks and take away into our normal day-to-day jobs. Because events like this are great because we're all experts of our own area, but it's good to get out and hear perspectives from everyone else in similar areas. So what we're covering today is just a kind of a briefer look at current observations, and then more moving into things that we're expecting to be the future, I expect for the future of the workforce. So starting it out with unemployment rate graph. As David mentioned, we're at historically low unemployment rates. What does that mean in real more practical terms? The phrase you'll hear is a tight labor market. So essentially, what we all kind of repeating what we already know is that it's difficult for employers to find qualified workers. One more graph to hammer home the same point. This is called the JOLTS survey because it's government. There has to be an acronym. It's called job openings and labor turnover. In my opinion, that wouldn't be that hard to just say that every time, but we have to call it JOLTS. And maybe before I digress too far, what this survey is telling us is that historically our hires have always been higher than our job openings. What we've had over the last few years is actually we're seeing more job openings than hires, which is really a crazy phenomenon in terms of what it means to try and find qualified workers. And to go back to the point about the unemployment rate doesn't fully capture everybody. There are still people in the labor market, there are people that are not in the labor market that in different circumstances may like to work. And I think what we're seeing here right now puts an emphasis on how do you get those marginally attached workers to actually come and work and come back to work. What I can say anecdotally from different people that I'm meeting with, one of the most common things that comes up is transportation in terms of trying to get people actually to the job. Another key point that comes up really repeatedly is doing things that are non-wage related, but get people back to work. So some examples of that might be flexible scheduling. Another huge barrier is childcare, and anecdotally, these are the kind of things that, from what I can tell, employers are trying to tackle in terms of getting their people to either come back or stay. Also, to go a little bit about the incarcerated population, another thing that we're seeing that hadn't been on the radar probably 5 years ago is getting the incarcerated population trained and employed, with the idea that it's a win-win for really everyone. So for employers, you have someone working. For the rest of us, you have an investment that's bringing down your recidivism rates by getting the incarcerated population back into the workforce. So moving on a little bit to more specifics about Walworth County. Looking at commuting, I don't think this is a surprise to anyone that Walworth County is a little heavier in out commuting in terms of having county residents that leave the county for their employment. Just a little detail on where they go. The top two destinations outside of working in the county are actually Waukesha and Milwaukee County. So this is just a little look at when people get up in the morning, where are they actually traveling from their houses in Walworth County. On the flip side of that, this is a different source on where are Walworth County workers coming from. And I guess I don't have a huge takeaway with this slide other than to say there is movement going in both directions. And there is a need to really be communicating with other counties and making sure that you have the collaboration, because we're not in a bubble, and we can't just expect to be totally contained within a single county. So from that standpoint, getting the correct talent into a job may require someone coming from Waukesha County, and exactly the same thing for Waukesha County. They would rely on people from Walworth County coming into Waukesha County. So main takeaway on this is just that there is movement going in both directions. So moving on now to more key issues that we're seeing in the future. This slide, or this graph, is one that is showing a really new phenomenon. Historically, the labor force and the population really grow at the same rate. What we're expecting is to see the labor force go flat and the population continue to go up. So you might say, how can we have population growth but not labor force growth? And we've touched on it a little bit, and it really comes down to looking at our age demographics. So first of all, here's our working age population. So roughly 16 to 64, this population is staying flat. So where we're really seeing the growth is with our baby boomers, or our 65 plus population, which is really kind of it's just a really unique set of challenges in terms of having a mass exodus from the workforce. So a little bit just about the baby boomers. Oldest baby boomer is 73, youngest is 55. So we're roughly at the halfway point between retired versus not retired. And I guess I should take a step back and say we use 65 years old as a benchmark. That's not to say that everyone works until 65, and not to say that everyone retires at 65 or doesn't continue to work. But that's just roughly what we use to give us a point in terms of retirement age versus not retirement age. So this is one of the key issues that we're seeing going forward, is is an aging population, which really means population growth with no growth in the number of workers. In a lot of ways, it actually plays well off one of the next big things I want to talk about, which is automation. So automation is, it really comes up quite a bit, and I don't think we fully comprehend exactly what's coming. So the estimates are that automation has the potential to replace 55% of jobs. That sounds pretty scary, but I guess the way I like to look at it is two sides. It's both replacing and then also creating new opportunities. So there's a net gain, but the scary part of it is that there's current jobs that aren't needed as much anymore, and then there's going to be new jobs in the future. So there's a challenge of, well, we don't need these positions as much, but how do we find qualified workers to work in these new positions that are rapidly coming and created? Just to go back a little bit though, it's not entirely new. If we look back from the 1960s going forward, there really has been a movement away from routine and a movement more towards the interpersonal and the analytical. So I guess it's not a new phenomenon, but it is a phenomenon that is coming at a more rapid pace, to the extent where it's been cited as really a fourth industrial revolution, with automation coming in, and just with all these changes it's creating within the economy. One misconception about it is I think we have in mind that automation means we have this robot workforce coming in and just taking over everything. That's not necessarily true. More realistically, automation is replacing tasks. And so the jobs are still there, but the more routine parts of the job get taken over by the robot, and then the person is left to the people, the actual physical labor, or the human labor force is there to do the non-routine parts of it. So in my mind, it goes to, like, I automatically go to programming. I automatically go to really designing the machines and taking care of the automation. One of the other things that doesn't get talked about as much that is difficult to automate are things that are working in tight spaces, or aren't exactly repetitive. So that could be like an electrician that has to go in and wire a small area. We're gonna have trouble creating a machine to take that job, or a plumber going in and doing and putting in the plumbing. So it's not entirely just these white collar programming jobs. There's also an element of the more traditionally blue collar jobs that are still needed and are still difficult to automate. So yeah, but it's really the biggest misperception to create is that the automation is replacing tasks, not necessarily a full job. So just moving on a little bit further on, what does that mean for the human workforce, or the human strengths in a digital age, like the slide says? And really one of the more important things comes down to soft skills. So you could sum it up by saying that what we learned in kindergarten is now the most important thing we need in the workforce. So it's communication and collaboration come up at the top of the list, along with problem solving. And this really isn't unique to any specific field. This slide, this image to me is kind of telling in that no matter the function, collaboration, communication, and problem solving come up in the top three. I hope I checked that correctly. So if you can find anyone that doesn't, but I think in every one of these, collaboration, communication, problem solving are in the top three most valued skills. So I have my slides out of order here, and I know this one is a little bit blurry, but one key point I took actually out of the same report is the idea to hire for learnability. I think it's a really important takeaway that the job that either the job you hire for or the job that you're taking today isn't necessarily, or not even, isn't going to be exactly the same in 5 years. So from whatever perspective you're looking at it from, there's really this high importance on continuous learning and keeping up to date with your skills. Or I should say, it's whether it's your individual skills or as an employer, making sure that you're your workforce continues to learn and knows that that they're continuing to develop. So going back to just really wrap this up here, what we're seeing right now is a tight labor market. I can tell from my perspective, having done the job 5 or 6 years ago, been kind of attached to doing a similar job with workforce-related information at tech school, and now coming back, I can say a huge shift that I've seen is that 5 or 6 years ago, the strategy was all business development, how do we bring businesses to Wisconsin? Now, it's a lot more talent focused, from what I can tell. So what I'm seeing now is that the importance is, how do you make your company a great place for people to work? And how do you make your community a great place for people to live? So it's been a lot more on the talent side. And I think for most people in the room, that might be a little more obvious. For me, having dipped away for a little while and can't come back, I can say that it is a relatively dramatic shift. One thing that stood out, I was at a presentation for M7, or one of their events for M7 about a month ago, and the speaker gave the example that they hired 3 new people. 2 of them, as part of the negotiation, made a concession for being able to take care of their dog. So it's just kind of it's really a new thing to be more talent focused in that, and that the workforce is more interested in those things that make their lives a little better. Next big point, aging population will continue to put additional strains on employers.